Next, we have Quraysh Ali Lansana. I jokingly call him Karash, but of course, everybody messes up his name, so I do it on purpose. His name is Quraysh Ali Lansana. He's a poet, author, producer, and professor. He earned a Master's of Fine Arts degree in the Creative Writing program at New York University, where he was a department fellow. Quraysh has been a literary teaching artist and curriculum developer for over 2 decades and has led workshops and professional development sessions in prisons, public schools, and universities in over 30 states. Quraysh Ali Lansana, I'm glad you could make it.
Good to see you, fam, even though you abused my name. And Erica helped me make it through the technological quagmire that is my relationship with technology in general. So I'm happy to.
Just to interrupt you for a sec, I just want to say that it's like all of the people I consider academic geniuses seem to have trouble with technology. It's like your brain is so focused on like your knowledge base and like spreading the knowledge that technology just whoosh.
Well, I appreciate the backhanded compliment, Erica. I feel the love in there somewhere in the midst of my deficits. So we're gonna lean on the love and sort of dismiss the deficit sides of that. But I do appreciate that, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm gonna begin with a poem, and I'll probably close with a poem as well. As Mika mentioned, I'm a writer, I'm an author of 20 books, an educator, a professor. I just, this is new news, so this might be a world premiere here on this conference, but I just agreed to become the interim director of the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation at OSU Tulsa, which we are developing now. In addition to be a writer in residence at OSU Tulsa and a faculty member in Africana Studies and English. So I am, well, thank you. And I'm very happy to be here. I just moved back to Oklahoma after being away for 30 years. I've started as of last month, or this month rather, my 3rd year in Oklahoma after 30 years away. And it's been amazing to me, but we also have a lot of work to do too. But I'm gonna start with a poem that I wrote a few years ago for the Ralph Ellison Foundation Gala, an annual event to raise money for the Ralph Ellison Foundation, of course, in Oklahoma City, which is where Ellison was born and where he lived. And I'll actually maybe even read another poem from that time as well. And I wrote this poem for a particular Oklahoma senator who often attends this gala. But just my luck, when I read this poem at the gala, he videoed in from DC. But there were enough folks in the room that were probably moved in some way or another by the poem. It's called Elephants in the Room. It begins with a quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A riot is the language of the unheard. 1. If a riot is the language of the unheard, what is silence? The disease of the privileged, the opioid of the wealthy or apathetic. Silence is only listening to the loudest mouth, an agreement from the ignorant, legislation of the partisan. Silence is authorship by the indifferent, cries of the powerless and poor. Is silence the echo of contrition, drone and dirge of the duped, allegiance to the status quo? Silence is sitting in a room when your boss calls Africa and Haiti shithole countries and saying nothing. Silence is sitting in a room to honor a native preacher of a shithole country called Atlanta and speaking, still saying nothing. Silence is 17 in Parkland, 58 in Vegas, 49 in Orlando, 26 in Newtown, 650 in Chicago. The NRA cash in their accounts loud as an AR-15. 2. Unarmed teachers revolt in red states. Teens with machine gun vernacular spray relentless hope. Angry tears, blood on their Nikes. They know testing only assesses the number of prison beds on the stock exchange. At a school in a Mexican community, a student wrote he'd build a wall around the hood to keep Trump out as we worry the windows for tanks, militia, or the INS. Our skin too anxious for dreams. Only white men can navigate the world without code switching. 3. I am not nonviolent. I am a teacher. I am not nonviolent. I am a writer. I am not nonviolent. I vote. We are not nonviolent. We care. And so, as I referenced earlier, I wrote this poem maybe 3 years ago, certainly before, maybe 4 years ago now, certainly before I had relocated to Oklahoma again after being away 30 years. And though I wrote this for the Ralph Ellison Foundation Gala, I was still, coming in from Chicago to write and present poems at the annual gala. And what strikes me, I think what moved me to open with this poem for this conversation, and this is a conversation, so I do want you all to feel free to add your thoughts and ideas via chat or by unmuting. But I think one of the things that strikes me now, right, is that that the president is sending troops to Chicago, just like troops at federal folks have been sent to Portland and on their way to Seattle. And we see right now for the last 50 some odd days, but certainly for the last 5 or so since these barely clearly decorated or signed federal agents, federal troops are been involved in those protests in Portland and about how the situation of their presence has exacerbated an already tense situation. And thinking about, again, having lived on the south side of Chicago primarily for 28 years, about how different what will happen in Chicago, how it will be very different than what has happened in Portland. And I think that speaks to something that many people around the country fear about Chicago, and in some ways rightly so. It's not all perception. Gang culture is pervasive in Chicago. It's very real. I don't think folks really understand that gang culture is actually a byproduct of systemic racism, which is what folks are protesting and what folks are maybe for the first time in some time engaged in listening to and acknowledging. When I say folks, I mean folks who are not of color, and certainly folks who are not Black. But understanding that gang culture, and we are now, gang culture, modern gang culture, right? If you think about, I'm 55 years of age, so modern gang culture has been around. If you think about Snoop Dogg. Think about Snoop Dogg when he debuted decades ago now on Dr. Dre's The Chronic, was considered the most dangerous MC in music. And 16 years later, he's selling Chryslers with Lee Iacocca on a golf course and now has a running show with Martha Stewart, right? So you can follow sort of what has happened with some aspects of the mainstreaming or the commodification of hip hop or rap in that regard, in that context. But you also have to think about it in the context of, we are now almost 3 generations deep in what we call contemporary or modern gang culture, in cities all over the country, not just LA, where it was really sort of born, this modern era was born, which has its own roots in systemic racism, right? Starting with the Reagan making the decision to outsource the factory jobs, the automobile industry jobs that led black folks en masse to migrate that far west to begin with. So Reagan outsourced those jobs in the early 80s, early to mid 80s. And now you had large numbers of people of color without work who had, middle class or, working class jobs and homes. And now they're all gone. Those jobs have all been moved overseas. And then with the Iran-Contra affair, this thing called crack was introduced to LA and became a street business. And that's a part of the evolution of what we call modern gang culture. But probably more so to my point is that as educators, and I've taught and I've taught at the school in the juvenile prison in Chicago. I have taught in minimum security prisons for adults. I have taught in schools in Chicago and some of the most gang infested and poverty stricken neighborhoods that you could imagine. I've also taught at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, which is one of the Cadillacs of schools in the world, right? #1 art school in the country. I've taught at very, very well-to-do private schools, and I've taught very deep in the hood. And one of the things that is very, I think, something that we miss as adults and we miss as educators is understanding that modern gang culture is over 50 years old, which means that it's very possible, right? I know that I have experienced working with young men in particular, but also young women who are in their teens who know nothing but gang culture. Their daddy, if their father's alive or their mom is alive, their uncles, their family business is gang culture, is gang life. And I think that's something that when folks want to dismiss the west side of Chicago, the south side of Chicago, south central LA, north Tulsa, and other northeast Oklahoma City and other locations with heavily, largely Black populations or largely populations of folks of color, where this street culture is very, very real and very apparent, is that they often overlook that, #1, there are young people right now who know nothing but that. Just like if your grandparents took your parents to church, to, I don't know, an AME or whatever, and then your parents took you to church. And so now you go to church in that same denomination. Gang culture, as we know it, modern gang culture, has manifested and functions in exactly the same way. And we often look at it, I think adults often look at this as a disease of those who are troubled or criminal, as opposed to experiencing it as, #1, a cultural phenomenon, just like being raised in the church. 2, that it is also an aspect or manifestation of desperation, of options. If what I see on my block are men mostly, but men and women who have on the freshest gear, with wads of money in their pockets, and I see them more often than I see a professor or a lawyer, or a doctor, if I'm not introduced to a professor or a lawyer or a doctor on a consistent basis, then I'm not going to harbor any dreams or any aspirations at all that I could become that, right? So, for example, one of the schools I taught in Chicago at 36th and Cottage Grove, so just south side of downtown, the young people could see what was then the Sears Tower, which is now the Willis Tower. Could see it, but had never been downtown, had never been outside of a 5-mile radius of their home or school. And that's not specific to Chicago. That's common to many low-income neighborhoods, particularly low-income neighborhoods of color. But the what that does to the psyche is something, you know, and my advanced degrees are not in psychology, but I wonder what that does to the psyche of a young person who lives in a lower working class kind of desperation, who is surrounded by shootings, surrounded by the possibility of death or serious harm every day. And being able to see the Willis Tower jutting through the clouds in downtown Chicago and have never been there, right? Some maybe a decade or so ago, I conducted a workshop at a Boys and Girls Club on the southwest side of Chicago, one of the most intensely gang-controlled neighborhoods in which I've ever worked and ever experienced. And so I was, there was a little, New York, there are bodegas, but Chicago, a little mom and pop convenience store, literally across the street from the Boys and Girls Club. And young people were afraid to go to that store because it was clear if they were going in that store, they had money to buy something, and there would be folks waiting outside of it to harass them, to take their money, to beat them up. And so, but I remember when I was working at this Boys and Girls Club that there was a young woman, teenage young Black woman child, who tested into the top high school in the city. And there are 12 selective enrollment high schools in Chicago, and you have to test into those schools. And it's more difficult to get into one of those 12 schools than it is to get into Harvard. It's because it's so much more competitive. And there's so many more hoops to jump. But at any rate, this young woman had tested into the number one academic high school in Chicago. And we talked about her path to the schools, Whitney Young. And when she got on the bus at about, 60th and Ashland or what have you, and rode the bus due north up Ashland Avenue to get off to walk a few blocks to get to the high school. Literally, the per capita household income of on her bus ride, increased by $10,000 to $20,000 about every 3 to 4 blocks she traveled on the bus. And I wonder, and even the neighborhood in which her high school, Whitney Young, is situated, is surrounded by $1 million, $2 million condos and brownstones. And I wondered, again, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I wondered what that did or does to a young person's psyche, that every morning she got up, a couple hours or so earlier from the school, needing to be at school, to take that hour bus ride. And every few blocks it was clear that it was wealthier and wealthier, greater or higher levels of income. Every 3 to 4 blocks she traveled to the north. And then at the end of the school day, got on the bus going south, and then it worked in reverse. And the closer she got to her home, and when she got to her block, not only was she returning to a very low socioeconomic level of very low socioeconomic level, but also the dangers and the risks of being a young girl, a young woman child in her neighborhood. And I wonder which you think was more troubling, which one you think would be more damaging, to never know anything but the hood. And the hood, I mean in a literal sense, and the hood, I mean in sort of a figurative or a psychological sense, right? A cultural sense too. Is it better to know nothing but the hood, or to see that something is better? See that something is better up the road, down the road, miles away, that you might lack the capacity to see yourself there, right? You know, that you might lack the capacity to see yourself there, right? I see Margaret's note. I work with students in school who have expressed that sense of, stasis, that they knew what to expect from their current situation, right? And how do we, thank you for that, Margaret. And how do we move them, right? Help them move, I should say move them. How do we help them move through that in a way in which we are instilling in them or helping them access the capacity to dream? But that dream, as my mentor, Miss Gwendolyn Brooks, wrote, that dream has to survive like an aria through garbage ripening in the hall, you know, and the smell of fried onions, and the gray of desperation, right? And the strong words of rent, you know, satisfying a wife, feeding a man in the poem, and in the context of, in the poem kitchenette building. But in the context of what we're discussing, can a young person harbor a dream and attempt to nurse that dream while dodging bullets, while fearing for their safety, while, perhaps even being concerned if they're going to eat that evening? How can we, as educators and as adults, because we're all educators, even if we're not in the profession, but as adults, how do we engage young people in ways in which they can continue to nurse or even harbor a dream, a possibility that their situation can be something other than what they've known, right? And interestingly enough, right, that same kind of pathology applies to systemic racism from white folks who have grown up here in Oklahoma in places where there's no diversity, and where all they know is what they know, all they've been and what they've been taught. When I was an undergrad at the University of Oklahoma in the early 80s, I met young white men whom I was the first Black person they'd ever met, right? And this is in the 80s. And that, I'm sure it still exists often in states like Oklahoma and in other places even today. And to think about that, it's very conceivable, again, making that parallel between that young woman and, say, a young white man or a young white woman, that if all that this young woman knows is this danger and this sense of despair, a profound despair, and that's what she knows, because that's all she's known, how can we help her achieve? How can we help her, and not just her others, but how can we help her see beyond, right, the community in which she evolved? And then the flip side of that is, how do we help the young white men and young white women whom all they know is heritage, not hate, right? All they know is white privilege, and white supremacy, because that's all that's the culture in which they've been raised. How do we help them? And then what makes the white privilege, right? How does mentorship fit in with this? That's a great question, right? I think that, well, I'll complete the thought, then I'll get to yours, Erica. How do we undo, again, with this notion of the parallel there, but one of the things that distinguishes the young Black woman from the young white man, right, is white privilege, is the fact that the textbooks are all written from the European lens, from the European gaze. History is written by the oppressor. It's only been in the last 100 years or so that history's been written by the oppressed and been given any serious consideration. And, you know, that, you know, under the cover of darkness, we're still, Chicago took down 2 Columbus statues for a man who actually did more harm than good, and wasn't the first European to be on this land anyway. So, and the statues of the Confederate heroes in the Virginia state capitol coming down. And then think about this, that the Civil War ended in 1863, and you want to get technical, you could say 1865, right, with the Emancipation Proclamation and Juneteenth in 1865, 2 years later. Why is it that there would be debates in 2020 about monuments that uphold or support the mostly men whom were not only considered traitors to the whole United States of America, but also their motivation for sedition was so they could continue the institution of enslaving Africans, of enslaving other human beings who they considered superior to. And so that there would be any debate in 2020 as to why those statues should come down or not, it's like, really, they should have been torn down a long time ago. What is being honored or gained from that, right? Who benefits from a statue of Robert E. Lee? Who benefits from the fact that Robert E. Lee Elementary Schools was just recently changed a year ago, but up until a year ago, it was called Robert E. Lee Elementary School in Midtown in Tulsa. Who benefits from that, right? So I wonder, right? Yeah, very good, Margaret. Thank you for that. So, and you can talk about that too. But to Erica's question, I think mentorship is critical. And I think mentorship is critical not only in terms of sort of intra-ethnic mentorship, as in a Black woman mentoring a young Black woman, or a Black man and mentoring a young Black man, but I also think interracial mentorship or inter-ethnic mentorship is important too. I taught at a school a year or so ago and that school will remain nameless, Mika, but I taught at a school a year or so ago where I was the first Black male full-time teacher in that school in 20 years. And there's an admissions officer, was a Black man, and at least one Black woman teacher in my part of the school. But I was the first full-time Black male teacher in that school's history in 20 years, in 2 decades. And I lasted a year. And one of the things that was striking for me about that year, right, is that bringing truth to trying to really do really serious diversity and inclusion work, you're going to get a lot of pushback for it. Not everybody's on board. But I do think that that year I was there at that school, yeah, you keep pushing. But, you know, me, I pushed to the point where I was escorted off campus by, you know, to my car by an armed security guard. But yes, you keep pushing. Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's most profoundly valuable for me from that experience is the relationship that I continue to have with several of these students who are largely white and very privileged, who experienced and who were moved by and listened to what I had to say and how I taught it, history in particular, which was giving voice to the folks, the whole, right? Yeah, giving voice to the whole, right? Yeah, Scott, racist fairy tales that pass for history. Yep, these lies direct the social edifice of white supremacy, divides white people from everyone else. Yep, poor whites are able to socially benefit from not to be the most oppressed, which allows them to accept the conditions of their own class oppression as normal. Yeah, well said, Scott, well said. And I was a threat to this school, and particularly this head of school's understanding of really diversity. So they paid lip service to it, and then the three after sometime in that spring, the head of school just told the three folks who were the heads of diversity and inclusion for the three branches of the school that he didn't have to do anything, and they all resigned on the spot. And I don't think there is a D&I team there now. I really don't know. But even understanding, even when I taught the Supreme Court case that, of course, has now been settled with the Creek Nation, when I taught that 2 years ago or a year ago at this school, I had young white men saying, nah, that will never happen. Our daddies own too much property. So it'll never happen. And then look what happened a month ago, right? The Supreme Court, said from a jurisdictional standpoint in terms of legal issues, Northeastern Oklahoma is Creek territory, period, right? And we're just at the tip of the iceberg on how all of that ruling's going to manifest. We've already seen some folks released from prison, but that's just the beginning. How that's going to undo some of the land deals, some of the legal issues surrounding property and land. We're just wait till fall and spring. This stuff is going to become much more and more complicated and interesting. But circling back, right? Let's see, what's this question? Has the ascendancy of Barack Obama and Michelle to the presidency inspired a real sense of hope in young children of color nationally and more so in Chicago? What has been your experience and your interaction with them in this regard? That's a great question, Lillian. It's a really good question. I will say this to that question. I will say that the Obamas are very real, and to young people in Chicago, to many young people in Chicago, they're real and accessible because they are just from down the street and across the way. And I think that the Obama presidency, the Obama White House influenced, gave some young people a sense of possibility, young people of color, marginalized people all over the country. But when it comes down to it on the day-to-day existence, the Obamas aren't in the neighborhood helping keep these kids safe on their treacherous path from school to home. The Obamas aren't there to help them eat that evening or if mama's gonna come home, or if the lights are gonna be on, right? So yes and no. To your question, I'd say yes and no. But I will say that certainly that the Obamas have done and are doing a great deal of great work for young people of color, in particular with the programming nationally and in Chicago. But I would say a little bit of hope, yeah, in sense that there's the possibility that someone who is not a white male could possibly become president of the United States. But at the end of the day, it's about how I'm going to navigate this day, how I'm going to get through to the next day. And that grind is hard on all of us. It's hard on all of us, particularly in a pandemic. It's hard on all of us. It's hard on all of us, I think, regardless of your ethnicity. But we all have to understand that many of us are very blessed and very fortunate that it's not as hard as it could be. Because of unemployment, because of the proximity to COVID, and because of wherever you live. Again, in Chicago last weekend, I'm sure you all heard that 15 people were shot outside of a funeral home, and it was very much gang related, and so we're experiencing a spike in violent crime in New York and Chicago and other cities as well, while in the midst of a pandemic, while in the midst of all this racial reckoning, and understanding again that that it is born of a seriousness of this desperation and the seriousness of this moment, that millions of folks are unemployed. I mean, if COVID-19 has affected the Black and brown communities in much more pronounced ways than any other ethnicity, which we all know is true, then think about what unemployment has done and where it's wreaked the most havoc. Think about what access to food and produce, childcare, even medical care has. How that's disproportionately affect people of color in this moment as well. And so the uptick in crime in Chicago and New York and other places isn't surprising, because folks are just trying to do whatever they can in desperate times to take care of their own, take care of their business, right? Which is, I think, also a national pathology that transcends race and class, right? Excuse me. So several years ago, I was teaching, when I was on faculty at Chicago State University, I was teaching on the Monday following the weekend that the murder of Trayvon Martin went public. If you recall, that was 2 weeks after Trayvon was shot that it became public. That same weekend on the west side of Chicago, a 2-year-old baby girl was shot and killed in her daddy's arms, her daddy being a gangster. And they were a drive-by gunning for daddy. They killed the baby girl. And so I asked my students that first class period after that weekend, I said, why is it that Reverend Jesse Jackson and Reverend Al Sharpton were in Sanford, Florida, marching about this murder of Trayvon Martin, and they weren't on the west side of Chicago marching about the death of this 2-year-old Black girl child? And my students, who were predominantly Black, said, it's about race. That's why it was about race. And I said to them, so are you suggesting that the murder of this 2-year-old girl child was not also about race? And they hadn't thought about it the same way. And that's one of the points I'm making here. They hadn't thought about it the same way because Zimmerman was of mixed race, but, identifies as white. Trayvon, young Black man, versus a Black hand shooting a Black person. And they didn't understand when I said, well, they're both about race, aren't they? About the idea that the shooting on the west side of Chicago is a byproduct of desperation and systemic racism and attempting and culture and gang culture and attempting to find a way just to put food on the table for yours, right? Not a justification, but making that parallel, right? And then I said, so after I said to them, so what makes you think the shooting on the West Side is not about race? My students said to me, well, shootings on the West Side Chicago happen every day. We're sort of numb to it. But if it's not me or mine, we don't care. If it doesn't happen to me, a member of my family or friends, we don't care because it happens every day. And that, I believe, is the national pathology regarding this. And you can apply that to police brutality. You can apply that to gang culture. You can apply that to the food desert that is North Tulsa, Oklahoma. You could apply that to the fact that there's not a hospital. The closest hospital to North Tulsa is probably Hillcrest, which is, at 11th and Utica. So it's some miles away. That the life expectancy between North Tulsa and South Tulsa is 11 years in the same city. That the rate of women dying in childbirth in North Tulsa is 34% higher than white women in South Tulsa. I mean, these are real, staggering, but very real statistics. And to think about, again, that idea that if it's not me or mine, we don't care. If it doesn't affect me directly, it doesn't matter to me. And that, I think, is a sickness. Again, I think it's a pathology that transcends ethnicity, right? How is it, ethnicity and class, how is it that we still don't have any serious gun legislation after all the shootings that I mentioned in that poem? Parkland High School, Orlando at the Pulse nightclub, Newtown, Connecticut at an elementary school, right? Sandy Hook. Yeah. How is it that we don't, and many of the people who were unfortunately killed in those shootings were not Black. But how is it, which you think might make a difference, right? But how is it that after all of those shootings, right, that we still don't have any common sense gun legislation? Because of the NRA, because of the politicians in the NRA's pockets, because of this idea that this concept again, that if it's not me or mine, it doesn't matter to me. And I think until we seriously create policy to get past that, we don't, we're not gonna get very far, right? We're not gonna get very far at all. All right, I'm gonna wrap up in a second and see if there's any questions you have. How did I get out of Oklahoma initially? I imagine there wasn't much representation of how to leave Enid or mentors for a young POC in Enid. Enid, Oklahoma is a little sad little town. But, it's where I was born and raised. I often I've often written about Enid in terms of the fact that, as part of what you just asked me, Erica, which is that I don't think there's a Black-owned business in Enid, Oklahoma right now. When I was growing up, there may have been 2 or 3. But to my knowledge, there's not a Black-owned business in Enid, maybe beyond maybe a lawn mowing service or something right at this very moment. And so in Enid, I did not see people other than my family who were mostly, my auntie, my mom worked in hospitals, my aunties worked in hospitals. My dad worked, Southwestern Bell, AT&T. I did not see in Enid Black folks in positions of power. I did not see Black folks. I don't know if I even saw a Black bank teller in Enid, I had one Black teacher in 3rd grade, and then my first Black male teacher in 7th grade. But it was my older siblings, and I'm the youngest of 6, and they probably before I even understood it, had a great impact and influence on me as a youngster, even though I sort of strayed for a minute and then found my way back. But, you know, my siblings had poems by Amiri Baraka and Nikki Giovanni on the walls of their bedroom. My brother had albums and music by Miles Davis and War and the music of the Black Arts Movement that he listened to, and so I'd listen to. And so I had this sense of inclusiveness and consciousness introduced to me by my siblings. And that is, and probably, to be real, in full disclosure, football. Being an OU football fan, and I've written about this too, and seeing Black men in particular celebrated and working together with in particular with football and basketball and with other white men to achieve a goal. One of my former student poets, has a great line in a poem about when's the last time you cheered for a Black man who was not in an end zone, right? And I love that line because there's a lot of truth to that, right? That sports can transcend race, but also, you know, I was playing football with folks who were calling me nigga on the other side of the offensive line, you know? But it was also an opportunity that I saw Black folks achieve some success and work in diversity with others to achieve a goal. So, you know, I am an OU fan. I admit it. I went to school there. So let's see, Janine, you have a question. Yeah, so unmute and ask it, please.
Thank you. So with modern culture and technologies, do you think that a lot of children in more low-income areas do have maybe more role models that they can look up to see if they can't get out of maybe the situation or the yeah, this is where I'm having a hard time wording it.
It's okay, take your time.
Like, I feel like with modern technology, if accessible, it's a great tool to help educate children and young adults and try to get them out of the gang culture or get them out of situations that are a vicious circle, basically. But I also don't know what is accessible, you know, and I don't know what role models they have when they watch shows or when they see other people and they're like, yes, I could be like that. I don't know what they're looking at. I don't know if they have that availability, I guess. And so I'm just wondering if we could make it more accessible. Do you think that's something that could potentially also help? Yeah, I don't know. Sorry.
That's okay. You're fine. You're fine. I would say yes and no. I will say that number one, that certainly that social media has both expanded and made more immediate the types of knowledge and access to knowledge and ideas that certainly much faster than what I experienced in my youth in the 1970s, to be sure. But at the same time, social media can also, and technology can also introduce us to a whole lot of other really, really destructive behaviors and ideas as well, and has a great deal of influence in that regard. I think it's also important to note that beyond cell phones, right, that many folks, and I'm sure you're aware of this, Janine, that many folks don't have access to computers or the internet in their homes. Yeah. You know, that was a real problem this past spring in Tulsa for Tulsa public schools when going to remote learning. Even with the doling out of Chromebooks, that folks still they didn't have internet access, right? So, I want to say there's the potential using technology and the internet to help young people see beyond what they know and see the possibilities of what their futures could hold in positive ways. Yes, but there's nothing in my mind, that is more powerful than an adult in their lives helping them see that.
Definitely. Well, and part of it comes from right now in the pandemic, we're not able to meet face to face with them and try to help them. So I was also thinking, could we not set up something for future where maybe we have Zoom rooms or something similar where we could work with them one-on-one or in a small setting, like a group class setting. So.
I think that's a great idea. I think that we could, you're right, like set up sort of like, one of my dreams has always been to create an after school and Saturday school situations where kids could leave after school, they could come to a place that was safe and they could do their homework. They could have homework tutoring, healthy snacks, physical recreation, physical education, art classes and various art disciplines. And it's someplace they can hang out that's positive and productive, and they're off the streets till their parents get off work or till the sun goes down or what have you. And I see that that's still a dream that I'm working on. But I also think that, to your idea, that idea could be translated to online social groups, an online social club, where folks get together. It's a safe space, and you can talk about, and young people can talk about whatever's on their minds. I think that's a great idea.
So I don't know if they're still open, but I know in Tulsa there is a place called New Hope, which kind of does something similar. It's more for children who have incarcerated parents.
Right.
But they do pick up children after school and help them with tutoring and small things. But they're a very small nonprofit which struggles, to do these things to help children. So, yeah. I don't know.
I'm familiar with New Hope, and then I was going to tell you some other thought. The Dream Center. The Dream Center in North Tulsa engages in some work like that, and that's a wonderful facility. And Pastor Tim is an amazing, amazing human being. But I think so that, yes, number one, to your idea, certainly that would work online, and I think it could be very effective right now to create those kinds of situations for young people to engage in dialogue and just hang out, because we're so isolated, right? And just the ability to be able to socialize is cathartic. And then, and you can build on it from there anywhere you'd want to go. But I think that's an excellent idea.
Well, in the long term, I think it would actually help more, because for nonprofits that maybe don't have the funds, it could potentially be a way to get rid of the having to have a brick and mortar place, which, granted, that would be more ideal because they're obviously in a safer place versus maybe not in a safe place, but trying to, watch something. But I don't know. They're just kind of thoughts that I'm throwing out.
Well, I hope you continue to build on those thoughts, Janine. And, if you want to talk about them any further, I'm sure that, I can share my email, or Erica can share my email and throw it up in the chat or something. Yeah, we can do that. Oh, and Erica's telling me to promote my fall class too. So I will do that, and then see if there are any other questions before we adjourn. So this fall, I'm teaching several classes. I'm teaching a class on Black Wall Street on Monday evenings at OSU Tulsa. And that is available for community members as well as students who enroll for credit. On Tuesdays this fall, I'll be teaching writing and racial healing workshop for 6 weeks. And that'll be at OSU. Well, it's an OSU Tulsa workshop, Center for Poets and Writers, but of course it'll be virtual. And then I think that ends in September, and then late September, early October, I'll be teaching a hip hop poetics workshop, I think. I'll have to look. But all of this is on the Center for Poets and Writers website. At least those 2 writing workshops are. The Center for Poets and Writers at OSU Tulsa. Then I'm currently teaching a protest poetry workshop. I will get next month. I will also be teaching a a workshop called Verse Journalism, which is a construct that my mentor, Miss Gwendolyn Brooks, created in the 50s about a poet, essentially poetry as journalism. I think that's all I'm teaching for now. And then in the spring, I'll be teaching a bunch of other stuff. So thank you for that nudge, Erica. Anything from anyone else? Yeah, all virtual for now. Although my OSU, the Black Wall Street class might be some sort of a hybrid, but I think everything else is virtual, is completely virtual. Any other questions from anyone?
No, doesn't look like it. I appreciate you, Quraysh.
Because you're in front of people now, so you have to talk proper.
No, I have to do it. I do it properly, or I could just call you cute. But
you could.
Appreciate your poem at the beginning. I always love the mystery in your voice. I've always intrigued by that from the first time I read. So I really enjoyed that. So